On October 15, 1888, the town of Fort Smith, Arkansas, witnessed something that would haunt its residents for generations. A wedding ceremony between 45-year-old Nathaniel Decker and 22-year-old Rose Sullivan took place just 3 months after the mysterious hunting accident that claimed the life of William Decker, Nathaniel's own son and Rose's original fiancé. What seemed like a grieving father offering protection to his deceased son's bride was actually the culmination of the most calculated and sinister love affair in Sebastian County's history. The couple's passionate conspiracy involved 3 failed murder attempts, systematic poisoning, and ultimately a cold-blooded execution disguised as hunting mishap. Local records carefully hidden in the Sebastian County courthouse basement for over a century reveal a trail of evidence that authorities deliberately ignored, and witnesses who mysteriously disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances whenever they spoke too freely about what they had seen. Before we continue with the story of Nathaniel Decker and the woman who helped him murder his own flesh and blood, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. Because this tale of forbidden desire and family betrayal will make you question everything you thought you knew about the lengths people will go to for love. The truth about what really happened in those Arkansas lumber camps had been buried along with William Decker, but the evidence was always there for those brave enough to look. Sebastian County in 1888 stood as one of Arkansas's most prosperous regions, built on the wealth flowing from its vast timber industry and the bustling river trade along the Arkansas River. Fort Smith, the county seat, had grown from a frontier military post into a thriving commercial center where lumber barons, cattle ranchers, and river merchants competed for dominance in the rapidly expanding post-Civil War economy. Nathaniel Decker had arrived in Sebastian County 15 years earlier, an ambitious young man from Tennessee with enough capital to purchase a failing sawmill and the vision to transform it into the largest lumber operation between Little Rock and the Indian Territory. By 1888, Decker Lumber Company employed over 200 men and controlled thousands of acres of prime timberland in the Ozark foothills. The sound of Nathaniel's steam-powered saws echoed through the Arkansas River Valley from dawn to dusk, and his lumber supplied construction projects as far away as Kansas City and New Orleans. At 45, Nathaniel cut an imposing figure in Fort Smith society. Standing 6 feet tall with steel gray hair and penetrating blue eyes, he commanded respect through a combination of business acumen and carefully cultivated charm. His late wife Margaret had died of consumption 3 years earlier, leaving him to raise their only son, William, then 23, and already showing signs of the weak constitution that had plagued the Decker men for generations. William Decker represented everything his father both loved and despised about his own bloodline. The young man possessed his father's intelligence and his mother's gentle nature, but he lacked the ruthless drive that had built the family fortune. Where Nathaniel saw opportunity, William saw obligation. Where his father demanded results, William preferred compromise. At 26, William managed the lumber company's bookkeeping and customer relations, tasks that kept him safely away from the dangerous machinery and demanding physical labor that his father believed built character. The lumber camps themselves sprawled across the heavily forested hills east of Fort Smith. Connected to the main mill by a network of narrow-gauge railroad tracks that carried massive logs down to the Arkansas River. These camps housed a rough collection of loggers, many of them Irish and German immigrants who had fled the industrial cities of the North, seeking work in America's expanding frontier. They lived in crude bunkhouses, worked 6 days a week in conditions that claimed several lives each year, and spent their Saturday nights drinking and gambling in the taverns of Fort Smith's notorious River District. It was into this masculine world of sawdust, sweat, and sudden death that Rose Sullivan arrived on a crisp September morning in 1888, stepping off the Paddle Here Memphis Belle with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a letter of introduction from William Decker. Rose had been born in County Cork, Ireland, but her family had immigrated to Boston when she was 7 years old. Her father, Patrick Sullivan, worked as a dock laborer until tuberculosis claimed him when Rose was 15. Her mother, Bridget, took in washing and sewing to support Rose and her 2 younger brothers, but the family struggled constantly against poverty and the anti-Irish prejudice that pervaded Boston's employment practices. When a marriage broker approached Bridget Sullivan in the summer of 1888 with news that a prosperous Arkansas businessman sought a suitable Irish wife for his son, the family saw it as divine providence. William Decker had placed his requirements through a series of Catholic parish networks. A young woman of good character, devout faith, and practical skills who would be willing to travel west for marriage to a successful lumber heir. Rose possessed all these qualities, but she also carried something that had not been requested, a fierce intelligence and an ambitious spirit that chafed against the limited opportunities available to Irish immigrant women in 1880s America. At 22, she had already worked as a seamstress, a shop girl, and a tutor for wealthy Protestant families who paid her less than they paid their stable boys. The prospect of marrying a lumber company heir represented not just escape from poverty, but entry into a social class that had always been denied to people of her background. Her journey to Arkansas took 3 weeks, traveling by train to New York, then by riverboat down the Mississippi to the Arkansas River. William had sent money for first-class accommodations, along with detailed letters describing his family, his business, and his hopes for their future together. His correspondence revealed a gentle, thoughtful young man who wrote poetry, collected books, and dreamed of expanding the family business into furniture manufacturing. But when Rose arrived in Fort Smith and met her intended husband at the Riverside Depot, she felt the first stirring of disappointment that would ultimately lead to tragedy. William Decker was exactly as he had described himself in his letters: kind, educated, financially secure, and utterly unremarkable. He greeted her with nervous politeness, helped her into his family's finest carriage, and spent the ride to their home apologizing for the dust, the heat, and the rough appearance of the lumber workers they passed along the road. The DeKalb mansion stood on Garrison Avenue, Fort Smith's most prestigious residential street, a 3-story Victorian home with wraparound porches, ornate gingerbread trim, and manicured gardens that showcase the family's prosperity. Servants took Rose's belongings to the guest quarters where she would stay until the wedding scheduled for October 20th, just 6 weeks away. It was at dinner that first evening that Rose met Nathaniel DeKalb, and her carefully planned future began to unravel. The DeKalb family dining room epitomized the refined luxury that Timberwa wealth could purchase in 1888 Arkansas. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany furniture imported from New Orleans, while oil paintings of pastoral scenes decorated walls covered in rich burgundy wallpaper. The table itself could seat 12 guests comfortably, though on this particular September evening, only 3 play settings had been arranged on the crisp white linen tablecloth. Nathaniel entered the dining room precisely at 7:00, as was his custom, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and commanding height. Rose, who had been making polite conversation with William about his book collection, felt her breath catch as she watched Nathaniel move with the confident stride of a man accustomed to having his every word obeyed. "Father, may I present Miss Rose Sullivan?" William said, rising from his chair with the nervous energy that seemed to characterize all his movements. "Rose, this is my father, Nathaniel Decker." Nathaniel took Rose's offered hand in both of his, holding it a moment longer than propriety demanded, while his blue eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice carrying the deep resonance of authority. "William's letters hardly did justice to your beauty. Welcome to our home." The compliment was inappropriate. A father should not comment so directly on his son's fiancée's appearance, but Rose found herself drawn to the boldness of it. After years of interacting with men who treated her as either a servant or a charity case, Nathaniel's direct appreciation felt like recognition of her worth as a woman rather than merely her utility as a wife. Throughout dinner, Rose found herself stealing glances at Nathaniel while William discussed his plans for their honeymoon trip to New Orleans. The father commanded the conversation without effort, sharing stories of his business dealings, his opinions on Arkansas politics, and his experiences building an empire from nothing. When he spoke about the challenges of managing 200 employees and thousands of acres of timberland, Rose heard the confidence of a man who shaped the world according to his will. William, by contrast, seemed to shrink in his father's presence. He offered tentative opinions that he immediately qualified with phrases like, "Of course I could be wrong," or "Perhaps father sees it differently." When Nathaniel asked about production figures from the main sawmill, William fumbled through his explanation, clearly nervous about making any statement that might contradict his father's expectations. "You must understand, Miss Sullivan," Nathaniel said, as dessert was served, "that William has many fine qualities, but business requires a certain ruthlessness that doesn't come naturally to him. He's too gentle for his own good." The comment was delivered with apparent affection, but Rose detected the steel beneath Nathaniel's words. Here was a man who recognized weakness, even in his own son, and felt no hesitation in exposing it. After dinner, William offered to show Rose the family library, but Nathaniel interrupted. "Perhaps Miss Sullivan would enjoy seeing the timber operations. I'm riding out to Camp 3 tomorrow morning to inspect our new steam donkey. A woman planning to marry into the lumber business should understand where our prosperity originates." William opened his mouth to object. Clearly, he had planned a quiet morning introducing Rose to his poetry collection, but his father's suggestion carried the weight of a command. "Of course," William said weakly, "if Rose would find that interesting." Rose accepted immediately, though she couldn't have explained why. Something about Nathaniel's invitation felt dangerous, and danger had been absent from her carefully circumscribed life for far too long. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the first hints of autumn coloring the oak and maple trees that dotted the hills east of Fort Smith. Rose had dressed in her most practical outfit, a dark blue wool dress with minimal bustle that would allow her to ride side saddle without difficulty. When she arrived at the stables behind the Decker mansion, she found Nathaniel waiting with 2 horses, a gentle mare for her, and a powerful stallion for himself. William was nowhere to be seen. "My son sends his regrets," Nathaniel explained as he helped Rose mount her horse. "He received an urgent message from our timber agent in Van Buren, requiring immediate attention. Business, I'm afraid, waits for no one." Rose accepted this explanation, though something in Nathaniel's tone suggested that William's absence might not have been entirely coincidental. As they rode through the early morning mist toward the timber camps, she found herself studying her companion's profile, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair. The ride to Camp 3 took nearly 2 hours, following rutted logging roads that wound through increasingly dense forest. Nathaniel proved to be an engaging companion, sharing stories about the early days of his lumber operation and pointing out landmarks that marked the expansion of his holdings over the years. He spoke with genuine passion about the work itself, the satisfaction of felling a magnificent oak that had stood for centuries, the challenge of moving massive logs down treacherous mountain slopes, the pride of transforming raw timber into lumber that would build homes and businesses across the expanding American frontier. Camp 3 occupied a clearing on a hillside overlooking the Arkansas River Valley, a collection of rough wooden buildings surrounded by enormous piles of freshly cut logs. The new steam donkey, a steam-powered winch system for moving logs, stood at the center of the operation, its boiler already fired up and ready for the day's work. Rose had expected to observe from a safe distance while Nathaniel conducted his business, but he insisted on explaining every aspect of the operation. He showed her how the steam donkey's cable system could drag logs weighing several tons up slopes that would be impossible for horses to navigate. He pointed out the careful positioning of the guidelines that prevented the massive logs from breaking free and crushing the workers below. He even allowed her to operate the steam donkey's controls, guiding her hands as she learned to coordinate the throttle and cable release. "You have good instincts," he told her as she successfully moved a 000 lb log into position. "Most women would be too frightened to try." "I'm not most women," Rose replied, and immediately regretted the boldness of her response. Nathaniel smiled. "No, you certainly are not." They shared lunch at a rough wooden table outside the camp foreman's office, eating sandwiches and drinking coffee while Nathaniel reviewed production reports and discussed the next day's cutting schedule with his crew leaders. Rose noticed how the men responded to Nathaniel with respect, certainly, but also with the weariness of employees who knew their jobs depended on maintaining their boss's approval. It was during the ride back to Fort Smith that the conversation took a turn that would change everything. "Tell me about your expectations for marriage," Nathaniel said, as they paused to rest their horses beside a creek that bubbled through a grove of hickory trees. Rose considered her answer carefully. "I expect to be a good wife, to support my husband's work, and to raise children who will continue the family name." "Those are admirable goals," Nathaniel replied, "but they don't tell me what you hope to gain from marriage beyond security and respectability." The question surprised Rose with its directness. In Boston, no one had ever asked what she hoped to gain from anything. Survival had been goal enough. "I suppose I hope to matter," she said finally. "To be part of something important, something that makes a difference in the world." Nathaniel dismounted and walked to the creek's edge, where he picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water's surface. "And do you believe marriage to William will provide that opportunity?" Rose felt heat rise in her cheeks. The question was inappropriate, potentially scandalous, but she found herself considering it seriously. "William is a good man," she said. "That's not what I asked." Rose dismounted as well, needing to move to think, to understand why this conversation felt so dangerous and so necessary. "William is gentle and kind and educated. He will provide well for a family and treat his wife with respect and consideration." Again, not what I asked. Rose turned to face him, noting how his blue eyes seemed to see through all her careful diplomatic responses to the truth beneath. "No," she said quietly. "I don't believe marriage to William will provide that opportunity. He's content to manage other people's decisions and implement other people's visions. He'll never build anything himself. And building something matters to you." "Yes." Nathaniel stepped closer, close enough that Rose could smell the scent of pine needles and wood smoke that seemed to cling to his clothes. "Then you understand my dilemma. I've spent 25 years building something that will die with me because my son lacks the will to continue what I've started." Rose knew she should step back, should remount her horse, and insist they return to Fort Smith immediately. Instead, she found herself asking, "What do you intend to do about that?" Nathaniel's answer came not in words, but in the way his fingers brushed against hers as he helped her back into the saddle. The touch lasted only a moment, but it carried a promise that made Rose's heart race with equal parts anticipation and terror. They rode the rest of the way to Fort Smith in silence. But something fundamental had changed between them. When they arrived at the Decker mansion, William was waiting anxiously on the front porch, having returned from Van Buren hours earlier. "How was your ride?" he asked, his relief at their safe return evident in every word. "Educational," Rose replied, and caught Nathaniel's slight smile at her choice of words. That night, as Rose lay in her guest room bed, listening to the settling sounds of the unfamiliar house, she understood that she stood at a crossroads that would determine the entire course of her life. She could marry William as planned, accept the comfortable but limited future he offered, and spend her years wondering what might have been. Or she could pursue the dangerous attraction she felt for Nathaniel, knowing that such a path would require choices that would horrify the woman she had been just 24 hours earlier. When sleep finally came, Rose dreamed of steam donkeys and massive logs, and the feeling of strong hands guiding hers, as she learned to control forces powerful enough to reshape the landscape itself. The weeks following Rose's visit to the timber camp established a routine that would have appeared perfectly innocent to any casual observer, but that slowly, systematically drew her deeper into Nathaniel's orbit. William, pleased with his fiancée's apparent interest in the family business, encouraged what he saw as her practical desire to understand their source of prosperity. He had no way of knowing that each business excursion, each private conversation about lumber operations, each moment Rose spent in his father's company was carefully orchestrated to feed a growing obsession that consumed both participants. Nathaniel found reasons to visit the mansion during the day when William was occupied at the main sawmill. He would arrive with business documents that required immediate attention, architectural plans for new facilities that needed review, or urgent messages from timber agents that couldn't wait for evening. These visits always included invitations for Rose to accompany him on brief errands, inspecting potential mills' site locations, reviewing timber quality at the Riverside lumber yards, or discussing equipment purchases with machinery dealers who had traveled from as far away as Chicago to court the DeKalb Lumber Company's business. Rose accepted each invitation, with the eager interest of a woman preparing to become part of a business empire. She asked intelligent questions about profit margins and production costs, demonstrated remarkable aptitude for understanding the technical aspects of lumber grading and steam-powered equipment,